The Vikings terrified Europe. They crossed violent seas in open ships, attacked fortified settlements, and built a reputation so brutal that their arrival could send entire communities running. But there was something many Norse people feared too. The dark. And not just because darkness made it harder to see. To them, night could belong to things that weren't human. The restless dead. Creatures hiding beyond the firelight. And beings that could enter your home while you slept. But here's the strange part. Those same long, terrifying nights may also have helped create the culture that made the Vikings so formidable. To understand why, imagine Scandinavia more than 1,000 years ago. Winter arrives. The days become brutally short. Temperatures fall. There is no electricity. No streetlight outside your window. When the sun disappears, your world shrinks to whatever can be illuminated by a flame. Beyond it? Darkness. A family might spend long winter evenings crowded inside a timber house. Smoke from the fire hangs in the air. Wind pushes against the walls. Animals may be nearby. And outside lies a landscape you can barely see. Now imagine hearing something in that darkness. A branch snapping. An animal moving. Something scratching against wood. You can't open an app and check a camera. You have stories. And Norse mythology had plenty of them. Even the sun wasn't safe. Norse mythology described wolves pursuing the sun and moon across the sky. And at Ragnarok, one of those cosmic predators would finally catch its prey. The light would disappear. For people watching the Scandinavian winter swallow more and more of each day, that story must have carried extraordinary power. But cosmic wolves weren't necessarily the thing you worried about when walking home alone. Because the wilderness also belonged to trolls and other dangerous supernatural beings. In later Scandinavian folklore, trolls became strongly associated with wild places, darkness and the threat of sunlight. But some of the most disturbing Norse stories weren't about monsters outside. They were about something that could already be inside your room. Imagine waking suddenly. Your eyes are open. You can see the room. But you can't move. You try to lift your arm. Nothing. You try to call for someone. Nothing comes out. And then you feel pressure on your chest. Today, we have a name for experiences like this. Sleep paralysis. But people in medieval Scandinavia didn't have modern sleep science. Folklore developed around a terrifying nighttime being often called the mara, a creature associated with oppressive dreams and nighttime attacks. And suddenly, the experience makes horrifying sense. You're not temporarily caught between sleep and wakefulness. Something is sitting on you. Something entered while you were asleep. But even that wasn't as frightening as something that was already dead. And decided not to stay that way. Norse sagas tell stories of the draugr. Forget the transparent ghost you see in modern movies. A draugr could be imagined as something much more physical. A dead person returning from the grave with unnatural strength. Some saga accounts describe these revenants attacking people, guarding burial places, or terrorizing communities. One famous example appears in Grettis saga. A terrifying figure named Glamr dies. And doesn't stay peacefully dead. After his death, strange events begin. Animals are harmed. People become afraid. And eventually the outlaw hero Grettir confronts him. The two fight in darkness. Grettir finally defeats him. But the victory comes with a price. Glamr curses Grettir. And from that point forward, Grettir is haunted by fear of the dark. Think about that. A warrior strong enough to fight the undead. Can defeat the monster. But not the fear it leaves behind. And this is where Viking culture becomes much more interesting than the stereotype. Because winter wasn't simply something Norse communities survived. They turned those long nights into social life. Inside the hall, stories were told. Feasts were held. Reputations were made. And people could compete with words as aggressively as warriors competed with weapons. One tradition was flyting. Competitive exchanges of insults. Basically, medieval roast battles. Two people could attack each other's courage, reputation, sexuality, intelligence or honor through verbal insults. Even Norse mythology contains famous exchanges like this. In Lokasena, Loki enters a feast and insults the gods one after another. Imagine a room full of warriors watching two people verbally destroy each other while everyone waits to see who runs out of words first. In a culture where reputation mattered enormously, language could be a weapon. And winter gatherings did something else. They helped communities prepare, socially and materially, for what came next. Because when spring returned, some Norsemen went to sea. And here's one of the most overlooked parts of the Viking story. When you picture a Viking longship, what do you see? A dragon-shaped prow? Shields? Oars? Warriors? Probably. But one of the technologies that made long-distance Viking voyages possible was hanging above them. The sail. And making a large wool sail required an enormous amount of textile labor. Sheep had to be raised and sheared. Wool had to be cleaned. Prepared. Spun into yarn. Then woven into cloth. And spinning yarn by hand is painfully slow. Experimental archaeology and textile research suggest that producing sails for Viking ships represented an extraordinary investment of labor. Much of that textile production was traditionally women's work. Which means the popular image of the Viking Age is incomplete. We remember the warrior standing on the ship. We forget the people who spent countless hours producing what allowed that ship to cross the sea. Without the sail, the raider doesn't get very far. And suddenly the Viking winter looks different. Those dark months weren't simply dead time. Inside those houses, people repaired equipment. Produced textiles. Told stories. Maintained relationships. Built reputations. Remembered old enemies. And imagined future journeys. The darkness they feared was also the darkness in which they prepared. Then spring arrived. Ships were readied. Sails were raised. And men who had spent months surrounded by stories of monsters, gods, honor and death sailed toward the rest of Europe. To the people watching those ships appear on the horizon, the Vikings were the monsters coming out of the dark. And maybe that's what makes them so fascinating. Strip away the horned helmet stereotype and the superhuman warrior image, and you find ordinary human beings living in an extraordinarily difficult environment. They feared what they couldn't see. They told stories to explain experiences they couldn't understand. They gathered around fires. They insulted their friends. They celebrated. They worked. And when morning finally came, they went back outside. The Vikings didn't conquer their fear of darkness. They learned how to live inside it. And in those long northern nights, they helped build the ships, stories, and culture that would eventually terrify much of medieval Europe. So here's the question. If you had lived in Viking Scandinavia, would you have been brave enough to step outside after dark?